You're 5 feet 3 inches and weigh maybe 120 pounds. The hiring manager laughed, not even looking up from her resume. This is corporate security, not mall security. We need people who can actually intimidate someone. The other interviewers chuckled as they shuffled through applications. But when she calmly reached into her folder and pulled out a single document with a Navy SEAL at the top, the room went dead silent. Because sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones nobody sees coming. Welcome to Silent Warriors. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Keep watching to uncover this mystery. Sarah Mitchell was 29 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall, 125 pounds, with chestnut hair pulled back at her shoulders, quiet and calm in appearance. When she entered the glass offices of Titan Security, the receptionist looked her up and down and told her she'd come to the wrong building, that the retail job fair was next door. This was Titan Security, and they provided corporate protection services. Sarah smiled and handed over her application folder, stating she had an appointment at 2 p.m. for the security specialist position. The receptionist glanced through the file, frowned, and asked if she had security experience. Sarah said she did, but when asked what type of security, cashier or doorman, she said nothing. She just sat in the waiting area, placed her hands on her knees, and waited to be called. In the waiting room were other candidates, all men, all large, all thinking the same thing when they looked at Sarah. What is this woman doing here? One of them told his friend that this lady had come to the wrong place, that this wasn't a bodybuilding competition. Laughter rose. In voices they thought Sarah couldn't hear, they commented that maybe she thought she was applying for cleaning work, or maybe for secretarial work. Sarah's expression didn't change at all. She'd heard these kinds of comments before, in much harder places from much more dangerous people. A middle-aged man named Robert Hayes called Sarah Mitchell from the door. He introduced himself as the Human Resources Director and led her to the interview room. The interview room was modern, with a large glass table and the company's achievement certificates hanging on the walls. 3 people sat across the table: Robert Hayes, Security Chief Mark Stevens, and Operations Manager Lisa Chen. Hayes opened her resume, quickly reviewed it, and noted that Sarah was 29 years old, had written security experience, but no details. When he asked where she'd worked, Sarah answered different places. When asked what kind of different places, store security, event security, Sarah replied, more at the federal level. Mark Stevens looked up and asked, federal? Which agency? Sarah hesitated for a moment and said she couldn't answer directly, that it was covered by confidentiality agreements. Lisa Chen laughed mockingly and asked if it was a confidentiality agreement. Had she worked for the CIA? Sarah said no, not the CIA. Hayes closed the file and explained that they were a serious business here, that they protected CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, conducted high-risk operations, and needed to know who they were talking to. Sarah said she understood calmly. Stevens leaned forward and explained they had physical tests, lifting 90 kilos, running 1.5 kilometers, close combat simulation, asking if she could do these things. Sarah said she could. Lisa Chen asked skeptically if she really could, saying she didn't mean to be hurtful. But Sarah appeared to weigh about 120 pounds, questioning whether their clients would want to see her beside them when under threat. Sarah's hand instinctively went to her left arm, to the tattoo she kept hidden there, the Marine's eagle, globe, and anchor symbol. But this wasn't the time to reveal it. She simply said that appearances could be deceiving. Hayes smiled, but it wasn't a genuine smile. He said, of course, but this job was built on reality, and the reality was that this position wasn't suitable for Sarah, that perhaps she should look for a more suitable job. Sarah slowly opened her folder and calmly stated that there was one more document among her references. Hayes asked which reference without bothering to look at the file. Sarah pulled out an A4-sized official-looking paper. At the top was a Navy SEAL, at the bottom a classified stamp. She placed the paper in the center of the table. The smiles in the interview room froze. Hayes looked at the paper, then at Sarah, then back at the paper. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the document. He whispered what this was. Sarah said it was a summary of her service records, the part she could explain. Stevens leaned forward, tried to read the paper, and saw that it said, Navy SEAL, Special Operations, Classified Missions. Lisa Chen's face went pale, and she asked if Sarah was really a Navy SEAL. Sarah said she used to be, that she'd served 6 years active duty. The room fell into silence. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. Hayes carefully examined the document and asked if it was real. Sarah handed over a small piece of paper with her former commander's phone number, saying they could call to verify if they wanted. Stevens wanted to know which operations she'd served in. Sarah said she couldn't say most of it, but she'd done 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. Lisa Chen asked how old she was when she joined the Navy, her voice no longer containing any mockery. Sarah said she joined at 18, started SEAL training directly at 19. Hayes was still examining the document and noticed it said, Distinguished Service Medal, asking what it was for. Sarah's face hardened slightly, and she said she'd rescued her teammates during an operation. When asked how many people, she said 7. When asked if they all returned safely, she nodded and said all of them. Stevens dialed the phone number and put it on speaker so the others could hear. The phone rang twice. A sharp, authoritative voice answered from the other end, saying he was Commander Peterson and asking who was calling. Stevens cleared his throat and introduced himself as Mark Stevens from Titan Security, saying he wanted to do a reference check on Sarah Mitchell. There was silence. Then Peterson's voice came, more careful this time. He asked which Sarah Mitchell, saying it was a very common name. When Stevens explained she was 29 years old, former Navy SEAL, Peterson stopped him and asked sharply who he was, what security clearance he had to ask these questions. Hayes leaned into the phone and introduced himself as Robert Hayes, the company's human resources director, explaining it was just for a job application. Peterson asked if Mitchell was there. When they answered yes, sir, he asked them to put her on the phone. Sarah took the phone and said, Commander. Peterson asked what the hell Sarah was doing there, what business she had at a security company. Sarah said she was trying to adapt to civilian life. Peterson asked if this company had security clearance to examine Sarah's file. Sarah looked at Hayes and asked if they had security clearances. Hayes asked in confusion what security clearance meant. Peterson's voice rose from the speaker. So they don't. Mitchell, watch what you say there. Sarah said, yes, sir. Peterson told them to tell these men that Sarah's service record was classified. He said, I can only tell you this. 6 years of perfect service, early discharge at her own request, left with the highest security clearance. Anything more is state secret. The phone went dead. A deep silence fell over the interview room. Hayes carefully handed the paper back to Sarah, saying they'd completely misunderstood the situation and apologizing. Sarah said the apology was unnecessary, that she knew her appearance was misleading. Stevens leaned forward and asked why she'd left the Navy, why she'd abandoned such a career. Sarah's hands instinctively found the tattoo on her arm, and she explained that after a while, you realize war changes you, and you understand it's time to come home. Lisa Chen asked why she chose the security sector, that she must have much better options. Sarah explained that protection was what she knew, that civilian protection was different from military protection, but fundamentally the same principle, keeping people safe. Hayes reopened the file and said he thought the physical tests wouldn't be a problem for Sarah. Sarah smiled slightly and said that if you've had SEAL training, civilian security tests come easier. Stevens, still in shock, asked how much close combat experience she had. Sarah said enough. When asked about weapon use, she said she was expert with various weapon types. Lisa Chen began taking notes and asked about teamwork, saying they worked as a team here. Sarah's face became serious, and she explained that you can't become a SEAL without teamwork, that your life depends on your teammates and theirs depends on your decisions. Hayes took a deep breath and said frankly, at the beginning of this interview, they thought it wouldn't be suitable for Sarah, but now they thought the complete opposite. Sarah asked what they meant. They asked if she would accept the job. Sarah slowly gathered her folder and said they needed to discuss conditions first. When Hayes began with, of course, regarding salary, Sarah said salary wasn't important. She explained her conditions. They wouldn't ask questions about her personal past. They wouldn't tell coworkers about her military background, and if they leaked anything to the media, she would resign immediately. Hayes nodded and said understood, asking if there was anything else. Sarah said she could guarantee her client's security, but her own security was also important, that this job had some risks. Stevens wondered what kind of risks. Sarah's eyes hardened and she spoke of old enemies. She said some people don't forgive SEALs. Lisa Chen took notes and said they understood, asking if there was anything else. Sarah said her shift hours needed to be flexible, that she sometimes had therapy appointments. Hayes asked understandingly if it was PTSD. Sarah nodded and said it was under control but shouldn't be neglected. Hayes said of course, and asked when she could start. Sarah stood up and said tomorrow morning. All three stood up. Hayes extended his hand and said, "Welcome to Titan Security, Sarah." They shook hands. Sarah's handshake was firm but brief. As she walked toward the door, Stevens called after her with one more question. He wanted to know if the commander on the phone was really her former commander. Sarah turned, and for the first time, a real smile appeared on her face. She explained that Commander Peterson had been her trainer, that she'd spent the most difficult 6 months of SEAL training under his supervision, and that he still saw her as one of his soldiers. When asked, "And you?" Sarah said she still saw him as her commander, that some bonds never break. As she left through the door, the other candidates in the waiting room looked at her. They looked differently now, because Sarah Mitchell was no longer just a waiting applicant. She was Titan Security's new security specialist, and what none of them knew was why Sarah really needed this job. Because the hardest thing for someone accustomed to protecting others to learn in civilian life was protecting herself. Subscribe to Silent Warriors to continue with Hidden Heroes stories.